Thank you, Jaya, and thank you to the Art Fair and to Quorum for inviting me today. And thank you all for coming. Um, so I have many different bodies of work, like Jaya said. And maybe what we'll do is, since we're a small group, we can keep it more casual. So if anyone has questions, even in the middle, maybe, just ask, that's fine. So yes, many different bodies of work. I work with video and animation. I work with painting and drawing. I have sculpture. I do site-specific installation. I have bodies of work where I've mapped illusions in spaces. So there's all sorts of things. And I thought today what I'll do is just show you bits and pieces from some of these different bodies of work to give you an overview of, the art practice I've been engaged in, like over the last 20 years or so. So I like to actually begin with, I'm just a little heads up. So my laptop and hard drives and all these things got stolen a few days ago. So this is another presentation that I've managed to salvage that has like over 200 slides on it. So you'll see me skipping a lot of slides in the middle from time to time. So this is a painting I did way back in my undergraduate years in Baroda when I was still a student, and it's called Pondicherry. And I like to start with this painting because I feel it has a few little clues of things that I was interested in and was struggling with even back then that, later found voice in some of the other installation-based work. So this was based on a visit that I made to the city of Pondicherry, and I stayed there for a month. And this painting was almost like a diary for me. So it was like a daily journaling activity. So I would go out, I would have a particular experience, come back, paint it on the canvas, go out, have another experience, come back, and it would become the next layer. And so like layer over layer over layer, this painting just kept building up. And the first few layers that I painted were actually just maps of the area in which I was living, because I was new to the city. So it was really about the idea of a city or the abstract symbol of a city. And then over time, I started representing, my personal experiences and interactions in the city. So for example, the lyrics of a song that I was listening to while I was working, are written up there on the canvas. And this is a man from my pottery class whose portrait I've painted. And then I've actually embroidered physically on his back the weaving pattern that I saw in Auroville at the time. And then towards the end of my stay there, I was just like walking through the city and I was just collecting these found objects, and there was, bark from banana trees and like a dried dead fish and shells, and they all ended up kind of getting stuck onto it. So for me, this piece really became about a layering of different vantage points of the city, different degrees of distance, from the idea of the city to the representation of the city to finally the presentation of things from the city. And this is something that comes up later in my illusion-based work, these different vantage points and how they shift perception. The other thing with this painting, and the reason I like to show it, is I always had this really contentious relationship with the frame. I was always fighting with the frame of the image, and I felt like, if I loosen it a little bit, like everything in this painting is about to explode and just splatter all over the walls. And I was always trying to find that relationship between the container of art and the art image inside, and, how does one negotiate that? And then we went on a field trip to the Ajanta-Ellora caves from our college. And I remember being absolutely taken by, how time had like eroded these murals and left behind these beautiful flaking islands of images. But more than that, I was really interested in the space between the images, these voids that had been left behind. Because to me, they felt really active and pulsating with possibility. And my mind's eye was constantly finding new ways of connecting this part of the narrative to that part of the narrative. And it was the first time that I'd really started to think about like the space between things. And then I moved to Chicago to do my master's. And some momentum from my past body of painting continued for a while. And I would be cutting up the canvas and shaping it so that the shape of the canvas could match the gesture of the image inside. So again, I was trying to find a much stronger correlation between the image and the frame, and sort of struggling with that a little bit. And at this point, we had a visiting critic actually, called Jerry Saltz, who came in and he saw this. And one of the critiques he gave about this piece was that he said, your work doesn't have like a middle ground viewing distance. He says, I can either come into the room and see it from a distance as this giant thing on the wall, because it's like 14 feet big. Or then the next place I'm looking at it is like 2 inches away from the surface, like all these marks and textures and details. And I started thinking that, if that's where the work is naturally going, so what if I just remove the middle ground altogether for a while and I just start playing with the really micro and the really macro, and let's see what happens, And so I started painting these really tiny fragment-like paintings on pieces of baked polymer clay, which is like a synthetic clay. And this is only about 5 inches big. And then I started arranging them and playing with them in space. And over time, these pieces started to get more and more sculptural. And because they were so tiny, people coming into my studio would start asking me questions like, see these 2 holes in the wall, like, are they part of your work? And I actually really liked this question, and I got really interested in the fact that, the architecture, the wall, which is normally an invisible thing, was suddenly becoming visible. And I thought, well, how can I, amplify this more? And so I started making these pieces that looked like they could naturally start growing off a wall, like a mushroom or a fungus or some kind of organic activity. And also I started playing with the surface of the wall to make it look bubbled and cracked. I made these sort of dioramas which were inserted into holes in the wall. This is about 3 inches big. It's funny to see it that big. And it's carved wood and polymer clay. And the thing about this work is almost none of this is ever like at eye level. So like you walk into a room and what it looks like is just a bit of scars along the periphery of the room. And then as you kind of go closer, they start to like reveal themselves. This piece is called Urban Fungus, and it's just 1.5 inches big, and it weaves in and out of the wall. And it's got Vaseline, it's got polymer clay, it's got bits of nails and wire. And when you look through this, you actually see like this red diorama behind it with these papaya seeds which grow and sprout during the course of the exhibition. And when you, it's not really a contained pocket of activity, because when you step back from this, it kind of looks like this. So there's also little holes in the wall, there's some moss, there's another piece. And then when you step back, you see more, and you step back and you see more, until basically like the entire wall, floor, ceiling, it all seems like these living, proliferating membranes. And all these pieces seem to sort of be migrating into each other's territories. So it becomes very hard to decide where does the piece begin or end. So my photographer would always have an issue with this, because he'd come in to take the photo and be like, wait, where's the frame? Do you want me to just photograph this piece, or is it this piece with the 2 holes, or this piece with 2 holes in the moss? Or, where is the frame? And actually, in a way, that's what I was looking for with those paintings, was to open up that frame and that place where the beginning, where the art viewing starts and stops, and what if that can become more permeable in a way. And also with some of these things, like I'd done these really goofy things, like I painted the shadows of these wire, and that pink reflection under the piece is actually painted. And so a lot of this, this question about how much is natural and how much is constructed starts to come up. And part of the reason this was happening is, I moved from Baroda, and, where you see like these trees growing out of the sides of buildings, and there's this very quirky organic interaction between architecture and nature, and it's surprising and it's fun. And then I moved to Chicago, which looks like this. And it's a highly, highly manicured city. All the trees are the same height and shape downtown. You never see a weed in the sidewalk. And it's the first time I really saw the landscape being turned into like another form of architecture. And to me, it was a landscape of like boxed categories and like manicured, manipulated nature that was somehow like announcing its subservience to human will, you know? It was a landscape of human control. And the thing about these tulips, which is what, I think probably instigated this entire body of work, was so you just come out of a really long winter in Chicago. That winter is endless. And find, like, there wouldn't be like a leaf on a tree or a bud, or you wouldn't see anything. It was just bald. And then you'd wake up one morning and the whole city was actually full of these fully bloomed tulips that you never saw grow. They were just planted in full bloom. And 2 weeks later, equally mysteriously, you'd wake up and they were all removed at night. So you never had to see them die. And so it was, to me, it was really uncanny, to take this like complex and, nuanced, like natural cycle and then isolate just this one part of it and present it for human consumption. So it was like a sort of immediate gratification that said, let's just bypass the journey, who needs that? And it seemed to be placing value like solely on that climactic moment of blooming. And for me, that was a value system of impoverishment. And I didn't want this edited story. And so there was a desire to start to present the unedited parts of this value system, and also to, start to pervert the sterility of all these perfect surfaces in a way, if I'm honest. And so a lot of the work started to look like weeds in the sidewalk, or like that part of nature that hadn't necessarily been like pre-processed and packaged for human consumption. And these are all like tiny little holes and cracks in the floor of the gallery. And when you step back from them, it kind of looks like this. So it really looks like nothing. It just looks like these tiny little blobs and marks. And the viewing of this, I think in a way, like it almost requires that kind of viewing that's there before our conditioning sets in of how we bracket visual information. So it's almost the way infants, I think, view things, like they're looking at a painting and they're looking at the wall and they're looking at the space between and they're looking at their mom and they're looking at a chair. But nothing necessarily is more important than the other. The space between it is as, they zoomed in and zoomed out, and that hierarchy of vision hasn't yet set in. You're not yet naming, categorizing, separating. You're just sort of seeing it all in one field. And I think the viewing of some of this work also requires that kind of more innocent vision in a way. And then no matter how obsessive I am about making every lump and bump and crack and water damage stain and whatever else I'm doing on the wall, there's always plenty, that obviously I haven't done, and it was already there in this space. And people, viewers that come in are inevitably sort of confronted with this question of how much of this is pre-existing and how much is artistic intervention, like how much is accidental, how much has she deliberately created, has she amplified this? So in other words, how much is the art and how much is not the art? And that's a question that I feel each viewer sort of confronts and releases their own boundaries of when they allow something to start or stop being part of that art viewing experience. And in a sense, the pieces, these sculptural pieces are almost like decoys, because what is happening is that people spend as much time looking at the wall between the pieces as they do at the pieces themselves. So in a way, what was invisible earlier and what was just the background ends up becoming the figure, the architecture becomes present. And also what I found is that when people start to give that quality of attention moment to just like the texture of the wall, for example, it becomes really hard to switch that way of viewing off when you leave the gallery. So, I'd have people calling me saying, hey, listen, I'm in the subway stop here and there's a hole in the wall and there's fungus in it. Is this your artwork? Or like, I've just discovered this weed in my garden and actually I'm just looking at it for the first time, although it's been there. And so I started to see how the gallery could serve just like a highlighter tool, right? To highlight something that had always been present, but for some reason hadn't been visible. And what I'm going to do now is actually skip over a bunch of shows and the Museum of and then this is when I moved back to India and I was tracing all the graffiti from the different tombs and making all these layered drawings of peeling walls. And this was in Zurich, where I basically used layers and layers and layers of paper, which I stuck together and I carved and I cracked to look like, the wall was falling apart. And the show also had these little micro interventions. And when you round the corner, it looks like the space has just exploded and the walls are peeling till they're in full bloom. And each one of these peels is actually, again, layers of paper which have just been cut and carved to create a sort of like artificial history of that place. And the paintings and drawings continue, and you can see how the language of the micro interventions, are connected with the painting and drawing. Okay. So in 2006, I was asked to do this public art project in New York on Houston Street. And what I ended up doing for this project was that I traced out all the holes in the sidewalk on that street. And I created these paintings, which were acrylic on canvas. And I inserted them in those holes and I covered them with layers and layers of clear resin. So it actually looked like puddles of water. So you'd be walking down the road on a sunny day and sort of come across these sort of puddles of water. And when people would go in and look into them, there were all these reflections which were actually accurate in perspective. So for example, this man's face is like, 1.72 inches, which is what my face would be from my eye level at my height, like that. And all of these reflections are actually accurate in space, but not in time. So what that means is that these trees that you're seeing in this puddle, they're actually there around this, except that this is an image of the trees in winter and now it's summer and they've got, their foliage on. And that image on the upper right over there is the underside of an umbrella of a fruit cart vendor from Mexico who was living on that street but then had been deported. And that is a reflection of a building that had existed on Jackson Avenue 50 years ago but had been destroyed because of gentrification. So in a way, as you're like walking down the road, it's like these little space-time hiccups where you sort of get access to these little histories, of things that have happened here before. And at the same time, I was on this residency in upstate New York, and I was reading The Little Prince again. And, there's this one chapter in it where he talks about how small his planet is, that anytime he wants to look at the sunset, he can just shift his chair and he can see the sun setting. And one day he saw the sunset 44 times. And I really, I really liked the poetry of that idea of having this eternal sunset available to you. But I also was thinking about those tulips and this idea of not having to wait for that climactic moment and having it anytime you want it, so if desire is like divorced from time, how does that feel? And so I created this piece, which is like, it's around 30 feet by 8 feet, and it's in fiberglass and resin. And I painted it to look like an impressionist sunset reflection on water. And then I attached it to the back of my boat and I rode around the lake with my sunset attached to me. And then later I installed it in the lake. So like morning, noon or night, you could have a sunset on demand whenever you wanted to come and visit it. And the idea was to actually make it later in colored ice so that it would actually finally just dissolve. But for several reasons, it hasn't yet happened. And I'm gonna just move past this. Okay. So, like working with these puddles and perspective, it made me sort of realize how fragile actually our perceptions really are, and how contingent they are on our, physical and maybe even temporal locatedness. And just my shifting my head 1 inch and the image in the puddle is different, and. So I was sitting in my studio in Chicago and just looking at like everyday objects in my studio. There was a stool, there was a table, there was a chair, there was a ladder. And I was noticing like how I was actually seeing it, which is in order, my vision was actually flattening out, and yours is probably doing that too right now, is actually flattening out all the three-dimensional forms in front of you into two-dimensional images. And for them to exist as two-dimensional images, like this table in front of me, I would have to draw it on the carpet, I would have to draw it on your body, I would have to draw it on the wall back there. And then from this one angle, it would line up to look like a three-dimensional table standing in space. But again, that perception was so fragile that if I moved my head 1 inch, then the form would just shatter apart and all the architecture would start to, reveal itself. And I started to see like how in perspective, like something is always hidden and something's always exaggerated. And for the first time, just, the mechanics of everyday vision started to become like this mystery for me. And I wanted to start spending, more time with it. And so I did this piece where I took a 5-foot tall ladder and I put it in front of me in space. And I also found the longest possible way to do this, by the way, which is a talent that I have. So I put this ladder in front of me, and then I put a sheet of glass, and then I closed one eye, and I stood in space, and I basically traced out all the contours of this ladder, removed the ladder, went back and stood there for like 18 hours a day, day after day after day, in that one place with one eye closed. And I had a poor assistant who was on the other side of the glass in the room, who I was just torturing by saying, can you make a dot on the floor here, a little to the left, a little to the right, till basically she in space was marking out what I was seeing on the glass, right? And it was actually a very interesting exercise because, what I would tell her is just 1 inch away. Turned out it had to be 10 feet away. And it really started to, show me how, wow, like this is how we actually see things. And so what ended up finally happening is it became these series of these splattered geometric forms, which are, again, about 35 feet by 8 feet or so, which line up just from one angle to create the illusion of a 5-foot tall ladder standing in front of you. And the surprise of this was actually when people were walking through and in and out, where it started to feel like, wow, solid forms are intersecting each other and somehow defying some kind of law of physics. So we grew up like all over the country. My father had a transferable job. Every 2-3 years, we lived in a different city, a different state, etc. And year after year, we would come back to my grandparents' house in Lajpat Nagar, which was 33 Link Road. And so for us, this was home, right? This was our permanent address. And I think like many people's grandparents' houses, like nothing in this house ever changed. Like everything was frozen in time. It was always the same painting, same upholstery. Hajmola will always be in the top drawer, in the nutty box, There was a system. And we went through so many changes that actually, in a way, it was very comforting to keep coming back to this house that was like frozen in time in a way. And my grandfather's drawing room was full of this, a lifetime of objects that he'd carefully collected. And we also knew the stories behind all these objects because he was an amazing storyteller. So some painting that he won in a bet with a Maharaja. And so there were all these amazing stories. But after he passed away in 2006, and I was walking through this familiar space, although I knew what all these objects were so well, I was no longer being able to perceive them the same way. And I felt like I had to, like renegotiate my relationship to all these objects somehow. There was a gap between my knowledge of what they were and my perception. And so to sort of, digest what this gap was, I mapped out, I drew out the illusion of his studio, of his drawing room in chalk pastel on all the surfaces of my studio in France, where I was living at the time. And it's from the vantage point of the entrance, so it looks like this, like my grandfather's living room. But it's, of course, actually it's drawn on a chair, on a trash can, on a canvas, on the shutter, on the wall, on the floor, on a shelf, etc., right? And as people would walk in, of course, the illusion would start to skew and shatter apart, and the real objects would start to reveal themselves. And while people were in this sort of disorienting world of this shattered, splattered shapes, they were simultaneously being able to see themselves on screen in a projection. And in the projection, they were in the lined up illusion of my grandfather's living room. So in a way, it was their direct interaction with the space was hard to grasp, but the mediated version was more graspable. And I noticed how people's bodies started to slow down as they would try to understand, the implications of an action that they're making in this space, and what is the implication of that same action in that space, and what it feels like to be in these multiple spaces at the same time. And the piece was called Mapping the Memory Mandala, because I wanted like a mandala, and it was chalk pastel on purpose so that as people walk through it, like a mandala, it will start to blur and erase, and I can finally say goodbye to that like fixed memory of my grandfather's, living room. And the process is a little bit different now. So basically, it's now a camera looking through a drawing on glass into the room instead of me standing with an eye closed. Now a camera is doing it. And whatever the camera can see, I can see it because I just connected it to a projector. So I can see what the camera is seeing. And then I'm running around in three-dimensional space trying to draw out a two-dimensional drawing and match it. So I'll show you a little video of it, which may or may not make it clearer. Not sure. And yeah, so this is, when it starts to get erased, and finally, I'm left with the dust. So here we are. So that is actually what the camera is seeing, and also what I'm seeing in the projection. And then so on and so forth. Bit by bit, all the real objects start to get obliterated by the drawing. And then people start to come in. So all these videos are on my website, sumakshi.com. So I'm just going through them really quickly today, but if any of you want to see them, in more detail, you can always see them there. And then that's it, the dust. Okay, a few years later, at the India Art Fair, which then was called the India Art Summit, I created an installation where I mapped out the illusion of my bedroom But this time it was just like a black and white drawing. It wasn't like a colored illusion that I wanted. And from the outside, this is what it looks like. It just looked like a wall with like maybe like a 6 foot by 4 foot projected drawing of a bedroom, right? And then people would suddenly start to see people walking through this drawing, and then maybe even intersecting parts of the drawing. And then the same people would come and stand next to you a minute later. So that sort of became a clue that, okay, this is happening live, like something's going on behind the screen. And so people would go and start investigating. And when they would enter through that back door, what they'd encounter again is this like really fractured, skewed world. But while they were standing in it, they could see themselves on screen, like standing on my pillow in this case, in that lined up illusion. And so they would be looking at themselves on screen from the inside, but also people outside would be looking at the same screen from there. And the other thing in this project was I also created an animation, which I'm going to show you a tiny excerpt of in a moment. So at this point, I'd actually been meditating for a few years, and I'd been studying yoga philosophy quite seriously. And I was thinking a lot about this idea of Maya, and the yogis saying that this world's actually illusory and it only seems real because you put energy into your belief that it's real. And I was wondering, what would it feel like if I was to inhabit a place that I knew was illusory and to interact with objects all day long if I knew it was illusory? What would that feel like, for example? And so I did that. I actually occupied this space and I created this animation where I interacted with all these drawn objects as if they were real. And this animation is done by, so for example, like for that bucket to lift up, basically I draw the bucket, I pose with it, I take a photo, then I rub out the bucket, I draw it an inch away, pose with it, take a photo, rub it out, draw it again, etc. So it's these drawings that shift inch by inch all through this space. And this animation is actually like over 12 minutes long, but I'm just going to show you about a minute of it right now. So then it's being drawn on the body, on the shirt, then it breaks apart, and then it comes back again. Etc. Okay. Okay, so later that year, I was invited to do a show in France at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Lyon. And I went back to the micro-interventions work for this. And at this point, I'd spent a good amount of time in both France and Italy, like, a few years. And I had really fallen in love with these pre-Renaissance frescoes and murals that I had seen. And there were a few different reasons for that. Like Giotto and Cimabue, and for the art history people here. And, part of the reason I loved them was, I think they married my two interests, one in these sort of eroded frescoes and these islands of images that I'd seen in Ajanta earlier. But also because, mathematical perspective was actually only discovered in the Renaissance. So before that, all these artists were sort of drawing these figures in these rooms and stairs by just using their eyes to figure it out, which is what I was doing with my perspective as well. But they would never quite get it right. So all these figures were always like tottering in a kind of non-place, which I found very awkward and very sweet and very interesting in a way. So for this show, I had these micro interventions in the wall, but I also had this ceiling which actually looked like this fresco that was like flaking and falling apart, with these art historical characters both collaged and painted onto it. And I also created these animations with these characters that were on tiny screens that I had like embedded inside the wall, and also in these tiny holes inside the floor. So that's like the angel Gabriel, and then there's a reflection of him, and he starts moving and moving around in his reflection. And the other animation is like Adam and Eve walking out of Fra Angelico's painting and entering a real apple orchard. And then this show moved to Rome, and that was a completely different museum space designed by Zaha Hadid. And there was no straight walls in this museum. All the walls are slanting. You couldn't even hang paintings on it. I mean, it was a gorgeous building, but curatorially quite a nightmare, you know, that had like walls that would go down 3 kilometers and that's it, like, you know, in these corridor-like spaces. And what they were doing for this show was basically just dividing the museum up into like these boxes. And I didn't want to work in the box. And so I said, okay, why don't you give me like a corridor space and I'll try to do something there. So this is actually like a 56-foot corridor. And I built this cross-vaulted ceiling for it. And then again, like I painted it and collaged it and drew on it and projected these animations on it. So it's actually like these art historical characters start walking across the ceiling and interacting with, you know, all these drawn and painted objects. That's me working on one of the vaults. And in 2014, I was asked to be part of the Kochi Biennale. And this is, this room was about 70 feet long by about 30 feet wide. And what I did for this was I took these large, heavy scrolls of paper that were about 12 feet high and different widths. And on each one of these, I painted different aspects of Kerala's history, but they were always fragmented. So for example, like all these trees that you see here and all the plants that you see in this entire installation, which you'll see in a minute, they're all taken from this Dutch encyclopedia called the Hortus Malabaricus from the 17th century, which is about these plant varieties from the Kerala region. There are also some, but all these plants are slightly skewed, and you'll see why in a minute. And there are also a series of animations that I had created and projected on the different scrolls. So for example, this glowing part in the center is an animation where basically I found out from an astrologer where all the constellations were on May 20th, 1498 in Calicut, because that's the date that Vasco da Gama and his Portuguese sailing ship arrived. And this whole new history of colonization was about to begin. And so looking at it as this kind of star map, like this moment destined in the stars in a way. And then there were other animations. There's one based on the Surya Siddhant, which is a 4th century text from Kerala that actually deals with gravity before calculus. And but it does it in this really mystical and magical way. So it's extremely mathematical, but it also goes off in the middle to talk about a sea of water and a sea of milk coming down from the heavens. And, you know, so it's very poetic and colorful. And then all these fractured histories line up from that one vantage point to look like, you know, the open pages of a manuscript book. And you see yourself in this manuscript book being held up by this angel-like figure as sort of like the latest character in Kerala's history. So that's people seeing themselves. And because actually the camera and the projector are facing each other, it's like a book within a book within a book within a book till infinity that happens. So I'll just show you a tiny bit of the video of what it was like to kind of... So this is the animation from the Surya Siddhant. So you actually enter from the back of the installation with these scrolls. That's Vasco da Gama and the Samudri Raja exchanging gold for pepper. So actually when you first come into the room, what you see is this table with this like miniature book. And this book actually has live projection coming from the front of the room. But at this point, most people don't know that because they've just entered. And so all you're seeing is this book that looks like characters are moving and, you know, flowers are blooming and birds are flying and Portuguese ships are arriving, and it's like an animated book. And then finally you like turn around and you enter the installation, and then you become, you know, a character in the book yourself. So again, I'm going to skip this project, but basically I recorded the breath cycles of 108 people and I composed it into like this breath symphony along with their words. Okay. So this brings me to the material I'm currently working with, which is thread. So basically, my mother passed away in 2013, and she was a highly accomplished embroiderer. And as a way of reconnecting with her, I found her old letters and I started to trace out her handwriting, and I started to embroider these letters that she'd written. And to me, embroidery is a much more fixed way of making a mark. Like, it's not like a drawing that you can just rub out, right? An embroidery, the image is literally tied to the fabric back and front, right? So I think in a way I was looking to make her words fixed somehow, to cling to them. But funnily enough, after I got done embroidering the whole letter, it felt to me like her words were protesting this clinging, that they didn't want to cling and they wanted to actually have this space and light coming through them, and they wanted to levitate. So then I started to cut out all the fabric in between the words. I did some experiments where I tried it on transparent fabric. It wasn't really working. And then I invited her embroiderer to come and work with me, who'd actually worked with her for many years before. And he suggested that there was this soluble fabric that we could try using. And so we then embroidered her letter onto this soluble fabric. And then when we were done, you know, we just dissolved that structure away. And all we were left with were these words that were levitating, just, you know, like an embroidery on air in a way. And I felt like that's what they wanted. So my mother was also an incredible gardener. So in all the different houses and states we lived in, often before she got the house ready for our move, the garden was ready, you know. And so we always grew up with these magical gardens. And when it was time for us to leave the house, often there'd be multiple people vying to move into that house because of these gardens that she'd created. And so a lot of the plants from her garden, some of the flowers and the smaller plants, she would press and preserve and send them to me along with her letters when I was living in Chicago. So I also started to embroider the plants that she had sent me. And so slowly, you know, it started to develop like into this, like this skeletal archive of personal memory, in a way. And some of these pieces I embedded onto bits of plaster and wood to look more like fossils, you know, so more like imprints from the past. So this show was actually called In the Garden. And one was about the memory of the garden and the archive of the garden, and a garden that once existed and is now just like flattened and pressed and preserved. And the other part of the show was about the living experience of this garden. And that's what this installation in the show was about. And I was actually thinking of two sets of gardens for this. So one was my mother's gardens that I mentioned, and the other was the garden of this Swiss hermit who, you know, he'd walked from Switzerland to India when he was in his 20s, and it took him several months to do it. And then he lived like a sadhu for like, you know, 64 years in India. And by the time I met him, he was living in Dehradun. And I spent a lot of time with him in this garden of his, which was quite a magical place. It was right off this main road in Dehradun, so it was really traffic and noisy. And then you'd cross the threshold into this garden, and it felt like you'd walk through a portal because suddenly all the sound would stop, and all the trees and plants seemed to have a different kind of light about them, and it was something quite astral. So this installation is actually an homage to his garden, and this is done as stop motion animation. So as I was embroidering and painting different plant forms, I would keep taking photos of them and then create a time-lapse video. So every plant that grows is like thousands of images, basically. So I'll just show you a little bit of this. So I'm just gonna, yeah, so this is also on the website if you'd like to see it. And another piece in this show, which also had to do with his garden, was called Light Threads. And this is, it's 3 panels of silk with embroidery on it in like this chinoiserie style. And I'd created this stop motion animation which gets projection mapped onto it, and part of it shows you the process of creating it, like where the hands appear and they start embroidering, and then part of it just starts to illuminate the different bits of embroidery, and it starts to animate like the birds and the flowers, and it starts to look like a a moving mural finally. And these are all different extensions of the same body of work, which I'm just going to now, skip through. But these are all from the In the Garden series. This was at the Bhav Dajilad Museum in Bombay. And this was in Belgrade for the Belgrade Biennale. This was in New York. Okay. And this was a show in Israel in 2017. And at this point, like, the garden starts to become 3-dimensional, and it starts to become an immersive space that you can actually walk through. And this show, I called it a blueprint of before and after, because this was a garden that was either just in the process of becoming and manifesting, or maybe it was like the aftermath of a garden that once existed. So it was either like this blueprint that exists in the either, that's about to become a physical form, or it's like the ghost-like memory of a garden that once was, and now you're looking at a specter of it. But either way, it was this really weightless, ethereal garden, and people walking through it, there was a lot of feedback about how I think it really created this very meditative space and a space of solace. And people remarked about how not just did their bodies sort of slow down as they were walking through it, but many noticed that the rhythm of their breathing started to slow down, as they were coming through it. These are the Hermes show windows, which I'm going to skip through, but this was in 2019. And this brings me to the final body of work that I'm going to talk about this evening, which is 33 Link Road. So 33 Link Road is my grandparents' address in Lajpat Nagar, and this is the house I'd mentioned earlier. This was a home that, they built right after partition when they came as refugees from Pakistan. And so it's been the family home for over 70 years. And it was listed as the permanent address in all our official documents because we were moving around so much. It was the only constant home that we had. And it's been the site, of course, of innumerable family gatherings, sleepovers. My mother was born in this house. My grandfather died in this house. My cousins were married in this house. So it's really this potent container of memories. And now for the first time in 70 years, the house is actually empty and abandoned because both my grandparents are now deceased. And so for me, this house, it went from being something that was this solid, protective, sheltering place to, almost like an ethereal, vulnerable memory in a way. And I think one of my most common memories of being in this house is really sitting in the garden with my grandmother while she was knitting and embroidering. And so I wanted to convert really these hard architectural surfaces into something with thread and something that was soft and tactile and almost feminine, and very insubstantial, like a veil of memory in a way. So I went into the house and I measured basically, every chitkani, every lock, everything. And because the house was built over the years in stages, no two bolts are the same size in this house. And so it was very lovely for me also to spend this kind of time and attention on these details. And then I made architectural drawings to scale, and then we embroidered them. So like this is 17 feet, this particular drawing. I also made the paper and I embedded the thread into the paper. And the rest of the pieces were arranged like this, like layer over layer of transparent, insubstantial, spectral cobwebs in a way, of architectural facades, like a labyrinth that you could walk through. And this is how it was shown at the Kiran Nadar Museum. It was in the white room. I made it in a white room with these white web-like images. And so I'm gonna skip that. And there's different details. There's bits where the thread architecture wraps around the real architecture, and there's bits where it's embedded in the real architecture, and there's some play that goes on, with these things. And now this body is continuing and extending, and but what's different now is also a lot of the architecture, like part of it stays rigid and then part of it starts to flop and the thread starts to unravel. And then there are other pieces where the staircase folds on itself, and I'm embroidering the shadows of these pieces. But I don't have the images of that work right now. They were in the stolen laptop. So, and finally, this is an animation which is currently up at Bikaner House and was shown in New York as well. And this is a door from 33 Link Road, and basically it appears on the wall stitch by stitch by stitch, with the thread kind of weaving in and out of the wall. And it takes about 5 minutes for this door to actually fully form and get filled up with the details inside. And then it sort of hovers there for a few moments. And then it starts to like mutate and shapeshift and fragment. And finally, it just starts to swirl and it dissolves like back into the material that it came from, which is thread. And it's interesting because in the process of that dissolution, there are parts where this door is sort of resisting changing its form. And so you feel this kind of tug and this push and pull where it wants to retain its identity as a door. And then when it finally gives in, it swirls almost like a galaxy, as if like a form that's done serving its function and offering its material sort of back to the stars. So these are just like 10-second snippets from this animation. And this is right at the beginning where the door is starting to form. And then this is in the middle. where the form mutates. And then this is towards the end, where it basically starts to fold in upon itself and just become thread. So basically, I guess making things for me is really my primary way of processing life and life events and some of the big questions, the questions which are too big for the mind, for my mind, questions around death and loss and transience and what is real and how do we perceive things. And for me, all of that happens and gets refined and gets processed through making something. And I know there's many different bodies of work and many different media, but I think for me, like what kind of ties it together is I think that almost all the work, I think it articulates a world that exists just before the world which has been crystallized and solidified by our perceptions. So it's literally like just on that cusp of the unmanifest and the manifest. And so it's like this world where, things are much more liquid and flexible, and that the polarities of this is an object and this is the background. This is the art and this is not the art. This is a physical object, this is an illusion. Those polarities haven't yet fully formed and they haven't been defined and things aren't yet stuck in their roles. So they move more in this kind of primordial like soup of potential energy in a way, and the possibilities are more open. And so I think most of the work tends to do that. And in general, it's mostly an exploration of space. And it's an exploration of space as gross physical place and site and history and physicality and architecture. But it's also like the space between things and inside things and behind things. It's us being in multiple spaces at the same time. It's the subtle spaces we inhabit, like the spaces of memory, that landscape of memory, or the spaces of imagination or energetic spaces. And of course, it's also about time, because space and time are like this. And time as memory, but also time as an invitation for viewers to enter into these slower rhythms of time as they start exploring these worlds. And about perception, and about how perception is finally modulated by, space and time. So thank you. That's an hour.
Thank you so much, Sumakshi, for really what was a deep, immersive journey that you took us on with you. It'll really be fascinating to see where you are in your practice 5 years from now. But I just wanted to open the floor up for questions in case anybody had any. Sure.
This is heavy. I mean, to me, I'll start with that. I have two questions. One, the question that I had when I saw the first, so to say, the painting where your journey started. Did you have, when you say like you stayed over there for a few days and one thing eventually led to another, you came back, you drew that. So did you have a frame in mind, or it organically grew from like one corner to the other? And please excuse my illiteracy on the subject, because I mean, just as a starter, how did that happen? Did you have a layout in mind that this is how it is going to be, and then on that the base structure things kind of like overlapped on that? How was that?
So I mostly don't plan when I paint. So for me, painting is very much like, it's one of the most mysterious activities of all the different art forms, which is why I didn't really talk about it today, because that can be a whole talk in itself. So for me, painting is really about just sort of following a kind of impulse that comes and just being very aware as that impulse is happening. So it just sort of becomes about, okay, right now, it's about the map, and as you're painting the map, and that's happened, and then the next day something else happens, and something happens in reaction to that. And so it really grew like organically. And the funny thing about that painting is I felt, so in a way, like each time I would cover one layer, with another layer, every time I would do something new, I would feel like, oh, okay, now there are 1,000 possible futures. Now that I've done this, I can do this and this and this to this, and maybe that's what it'll look like. And then the next day I would come and do this other thing, and part of me is like, no, but then none of those things can happen. And then that would happen, and I would feel all these 1,000 futures are getting shut down, but now a new 1,000 futures are opening up. And this keeps continuing. And the strange thing about it is that after that painting was finished, a few years later, I felt that somehow, even though these layers are covered and obscured, it somehow holds those futures inside it. And I don't know how else to explain it, because people have come in and said things when they look at it which are not on the surface. And they're like, oh, it makes me feel like that. And I'm like, damn, that was like 15 layers down. Like how is that? So I don't know, I find it a very mysterious process, how it works.
Okay, and second question, am I the only one who has the feeling that the times that we are living in, it's a great catalyst for your work, considering you're already playing with virtual and reality, and the times are such that we've been encountering that in, so to say, real.
Yeah.
So, am I the only one who has that feeling, or do you also feel the same for your work, that this is catalyst, this is going to speed up like real fast from here?
No, I definitely feel like it's a catalyst. So, when I'd started making these pieces, one of the things I was thinking about is that our generation is used to being in multiple spaces at the same time, right? I'm sitting here, but my consciousness is also divided over WhatsApp and Skype and Facebook, and there are these 20 virtual me's. And which one is more me than the other me? I don't know, right? It's where your attention's at. So I definitely feel we are, we are at this, we're at a very interesting point, I think, where, I'll just say that.
Thank you so much.
I'm awestruck actually, because understanding. See, one process is, as a viewer, you walk into a space and you see something, then you use your mind to understand it and process it, and then to hear. But when you hear the lecture from you and this talk, the complexity of what you have created and why you have created it is coming through. So I think this is, we have to do more of these, Jaya. This is wonderful. But what I'm noticing through the process, you're losing color. Is this is this a conscious thing? Are you moving away from it? Why are you moving away from it?
So I'm actually back to color now.
Oh, you are?
Yeah, but that's the body of work that's gone with the laptop. So, but I will ask them to send me photos when they're done installing it in Australia. But so see, what's been happening with this work is, because it was really about memory, color is very present. Anytime there's color in something, it has it makes a strong statement. It has its own identity. Because these pieces were so much about memory, and I just wanted it to be almost like these X-rays and almost disappear. Like, in a way, the white on white pieces that you saw, they weren't even, a lot of them you couldn't actually see. You was only seeing their shadows. So the piece was only registering through its shadows. I mean, they were that invisible, right? Now the work that I'm making is actually, it's using different colored threads, and a lot of the colors are like taken from like faded blueprints, those ammonia prints. So it goes all the way from pink to maroon to dark blue. And so they're starting to look a lot more graphic and like drawings, right? And that's doing a whole other thing with the work. So that's not work that I would install in that space, because it's not really evocative in the same way, but they become more like these graphic drawings and one of a kind, like one piece, with each piece doing a different thing. So
nice to know. May I follow that up with one more question? This is a little more about the business of art. I mean, as your work is conceptual. There's thought running through it. It's not like you choose it not to be within a frame. Where do you sell it? Who buys it? Who displays it? How does the finance of this thing work?
Yeah. So there is a lot of work which are in frames and which are sculptural and which are commissions, right? So I haven't got a lot of that in here. But like a lot of the work from the In the Garden series, for example, are in several, private collections and offices. Even the projection mapping on the silk is a piece that's been bought by someone. Some of these installations are bought by the museum. So the Kiran Nadar Museum of Art has bought that installation, for example. But there are a lot of individual pieces as well, like those vitrines. I don't know if you remember seeing them, like the glass vitrines, and I'll just show you in a second. Like these, right? So these are sort of individual pieces that that are easier for people, to buy. And then there are paintings, and then there are these other like framed screens, and so there's a lot of there's a lot of other object-based work as well, like these. So I mean, these are all sold and with different people. This is with Soho House in Bombay. And this is with the collector in Delhi. Yeah, some of these are also all over the place. So yeah, some of this sells, and some of the more conceptual stuff. The earlier stuff that I was doing, that was actually, I didn't even put it up for sale. I just said it was not for sale because the whole idea was to just make it and let it destroy. It's really only after the thread work started that I've actually been selling things, because before that, a lot of the work was just ephemeral, like it could only exist. So I would live off my teaching, that was my salary, and then I would live off sometimes museums or the gallery gives you like a stipend or a production budget to come make the work, and that's it. And live off my dad as well.
Lovely. Thank you, Dad.
I have a follow-up for that. So you did the Hermes storefront in 2019, and as someone whose work is so deeply personal and the commercialization was a side effect, I would say. Mm-hmm. How did that process work? How did you feel, a little bit about that?
It's a really, really good question. So this was probably the toughest thing I've ever done in my life. Let me start with that. Because
fashion's not easy at all.
No, because as an artist, like at least I am so used to just working from inside out. It was a completely different mindset that was required to work with it as design and visual merchandising. And also what was happening was, my sensibility is to go quieter and quieter and more invisible. And visual merchandising needs you to get louder and louder and, So it was about trying to find some image where these two value systems can coexist without diluting each other. And of course, it's also like, these are all their products, like this is their scarf and, their perfumes, etc. So it was actually an incredibly, it took me 1,500 renderings before, it was about a year and a half of work. And also because they work, they work in so for me, I'm taking my work, I'm going to the window, and then I'm just going to see what happens. And they're like, no, that's not how we work. Like, you need to, give us a drawing accurate down to 2 millimeters where you plan to place this and that. And I'm like, or send me the drawings of your plant forms. And I'm like, the drawings aren't going to show you what they're like. Like, once they're embroidered, thread is going to do its own thing, right? So it was, it was a totally different way of working.
Were you happy with the result?
At the end of it, I was very happy with the result, yeah. Because I felt like it managed to do both, where it did manage to, I did manage to hold on to my sensibility, and I felt I also, let them do what they wanted. It was called Pages of a Dream Journal because their theme for the year was dreams. And so this was like a journal in the middle window. And basically all the images that you see in the journal actually sort of come to three-dimensional life in the windows. So all the windows are directly 3D versions of what are printed in these pages that are like flying out of these journals. Yeah.
That's very interesting. Follow up. Was the process that hard that's why you haven't done it again, or would you do something like this again if it comes across?
COVID happened, and they've asked me to do more windows in Singapore and stuff. I think I'm gonna think about it. No, I'll tell you why. It's not because I didn't enjoy it, and it's not because I didn't like the final result, but it's just for me to switch my way of thinking. It takes so much energy and time out of the way I normally work. It has to be something that I'm actually, then saying like, okay, that's it. 6 months of my life, I'm only concentrating on this. So it's more about that. But no, I mean, I told them I'd consider the Singapore windows too. So yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for joining us. One more question.
All right, hi.
Hi.
So do you see your work sort of being tokenized into NFTs in the near future? Maybe some of your projection mapping stuff or your animations?
It's funny. I know almost nothing about NFTs, and I have a cousin who's like a private equity guy who's been calling me and telling me like, come on, you got to start this NFT thing. And I keep promising him, okay, I promise I'm going to research it, but I really don't know much about it, but I will do my research since I've promised him.
Got it. And another question is, I'm not sure if you've heard of this artist called Daniel Arsham from the US.
No.
So he also works with eroded walls and
Arsham.
sculptures and stuff. And then what he's done to monetize it, coming off of her question, is she's basically started an interior design company where people just invite him to their homes and leave him with a wall, and then they do his interiors in that sense.
So you're the guy I have to come to if I'm trying to make a business plan, huh?
I don't know, I guess he's just leading you towards one artist that I saw your work resemble.
Thank you. Okay, thank you everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks.